on to Mr. Kram for 5 minutes.
Okay, well, thank you to all the witnesses for being here today and for all of your good work in the negotiation process. My question is about supply management. I had a meeting this morning with representatives from Sask Milk, and there seemed to be some confusion about the tariffs that are imposed if Canadian milk exports exceed a certain threshold. So I was wondering if you could clarify the export tariffs that Canadian dairy producers have to pay. Is that only for exports to the United States and Mexico, or is that to exports to the rest of the world?
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for the question. The provision that you're talking about, which applies to 3 specific dairy products that are set out in the agreement, covers Canada's exports of those products to all countries.
And is there a similar requirement under the old NAFTA?
There is not.
Are there similar requirements in the Trans-Pacific Partnership or the European Union trade deal or any other free trade agreement into which Canada has ever entered?
I'm aware of no similar provision in any of our other trade agreements.
So I was wondering if the negotiating team could give us some insight into how that particular requirement made it into the new NAFTA.
Certainly. Thank you, Chair, again, and thank you for the question. The provisions on affecting the dairy sector in Canada are designed to respond to specific interests and concerns as expressed by the United States during the course of the negotiations. In particular, the United States had expressed to us repeatedly throughout the negotiations concerns with respect to the market impact of dairy pricing changes that had been introduced in Canada in February of 2017 as part of the National Dairy Ingredient Strategy, whereby we established in Canada a new class of dairy products called Class 7 that had a competitive pricing linked to international reference prices to, among other things, encourage investment in the dairy processing sector in Canada and to allow the sector to produce more innovative products. The United States had expressed concerns with respect to the impact that change had in the first instance on the access into the Canadian market of certain types of dairy products, and then with respect to the possibility that Canadian exports of certain types of products that benefited from that new pricing class were displacing exports of American products from markets that they had traditionally exported to. We examined a number of ways of addressing those U.S. concerns through the course of the negotiations and ultimately determined that this was the least objectionable way forward.
All right, thank you. I also have some questions about the environmental standards that came up a little bit earlier in these meetings, and indeed earlier this week and last week in the House of Commons, some Liberal members made the statement that we do not want to have a race to the bottom when it comes to environmental standards. So I'm wondering, do the United States and Mexico, have they ratified the Paris Accord?
Well, I'm sure you're aware that the U.S. has not ratified the Paris Accord. Offhand, Mexico, yes. Mexico has ratified the Paris Accord. All
right. So in my province of Saskatchewan, in the southern part of the province, there's what's known as the Bakken oil field, where half of this oil field is on the Canadian side of the border and half is on the American side. And as I'm sure you're aware, the federal government recently imposed a carbon tax on the province of Saskatchewan. So I'm wondering, are there any requirements in the new NAFTA for oil drilling operations in North Dakota or Montana to have to pay a carbon tax or similar fees the same way that is the case on the Canadian side of the border?
There are no specific requirements in that regard, although we do have provisions under the Environmental Cooperation Agreement that we would cooperate on various issues related to climate change, even though we did get a significant amount of resistance from the U.S. on issues related to climate change. But when it comes to many of the elements, including some of those that you're referring to, we do have this environmental cooperation agreement that obliges us to discuss these kinds of issues and try to find ways forward that we can both live with. But the issue of specific carbon taxes applying in a cross-border kind of fashion was not addressed.
All right.